The morning sky above Okinawa's Kakazu Ridge turned suddenly wrong on April 11th, 1945. Private First Class Tadashi Koga crouched inside what he had been assured was safety itself. A reinforced concrete bunker dug 15 feet into the coral limestone, with 3 feet of overhead protection and a carefully angled firing port facing the advancing American lines. He had spent 3 weeks helping to construct this position, following the defensive doctrine that had been drilled into every Japanese soldier since basic training. Dig deep, build strong, make the Americans pay in blood for every yard. The doctrine promised that good fortifications could multiply a defender's effectiveness tenfold. What the doctrine hadn't mentioned was that the Americans had developed something that turned the fundamental logic of defensive warfare inside out. The first shell announced itself with that familiar high-pitched whistle that every soldier learned to interpret: distance, trajectory, likely impact point. Koga's training kicked in automatically. He pressed himself against the bunker's rear wall away from the firing port and waited for the impact. In conventional artillery bombardment, shells buried themselves in earth or struck fortifications directly. The explosion came from ground level. A well-built bunker absorbed the blast, channeled it upward and outward. Men inside stayed safe. That was the contract between soldier and fortification, tested and proven across centuries of warfare. The whistle grew louder. Koga counted in his head, an unconscious habit. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The shell exploded 27 feet above the ground, directly over his bunker. The blast wave didn't hit the reinforced concrete roof. It swept downward through the air itself, a hemisphere of pressure and shrapnel that ignored his fortification's strongest feature. The overpressure wave punched through the firing port like a malevolent fist. The confined space amplified the effect. Koga's world became a chaos of ringing ears, dust, blood, and the terrible understanding that the protection he'd counted on had become a trap. The 2 men who had been near the firing port died instantly. Koga survived because he'd been farther back, but the blast concussion knocked him unconscious against the bunker wall. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. When Koga regained consciousness minutes later, his ears were bleeding, and every breath sent stabbing pains through his chest. But he was alive, and that gave him time to confront a devastating question. How could the Americans make artillery shells explode in midair precisely above defensive positions? And if they could do this at will, what did it mean for the entire defensive strategy that Japanese forces were betting their lives on? To understand the full horror of what Koga experienced that morning requires stepping back nearly 4 years to the moment when Japanese military doctrine committed itself completely to a defensive philosophy that assumed certain fundamental rules about how artillery worked. Rules that American engineers were secretly rewriting in laboratories thousands of miles away. In December of 1941, when Japanese forces struck Pearl Harbor and swept across the Pacific, their military doctrine had been shaped by careful study of European warfare. Japanese military theorists had watched the Spanish Civil War and the opening phases of World War II in Europe. They had seen how modern firepower could shred attacking infantry, how defensive positions on high ground could dominate approaches, how fortifications could multiply the combat effectiveness of outnumbered defenders. The lessons seemed clear. When facing an enemy with superior industrial production and unlimited resources, a defender's best hope was to make territory so costly to take that the attacker's will would break before the defender's manpower ran out. By 1943, after defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal had shifted the strategic initiative to American forces, Japanese defensive doctrine had crystallized around a core concept: defense in depth, anchored by mutually supporting fortified positions. Japanese military engineers studied the defensive works that had bloodied attackers on the Western Front in World War I. They analyzed Soviet defensive positions that had slowed German advances. They developed construction standards for bunkers and pillboxes that emphasized overhead protection, interlocking fields of fire, and positions dug so deep into terrain that only direct hits from the largest caliber shells could destroy them. The defensive manual issued to Japanese forces in 1944 specified minimum construction standards. Bunkers should have at least 2 meters of overhead protection, preferably reinforced concrete over coral rock or volcanic stone. Walls should be thick enough to withstand repeated hits from 75-millimeter shells. Firing ports should be narrow and angled to prevent direct fire penetration. Multiple positions should support each other so that attackers approaching one position would be caught in crossfire from others. And critically, positions should be positioned to take advantage of terrain that would force attackers uphill across open ground or through natural choke points where American advantages in tanks and artillery would be minimized. This wasn't desperate improvisation. This was systematic military engineering based on centuries of defensive warfare experience. Japanese engineers and troops devoted enormous labor to implementation. On islands like Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, they dug thousands of fortified positions, connected them with tunnels, stocked them with ammunition and supplies, and prepared to exact a terrible price for every advance. The defensive positions at Peleliu's Umurbrogel ridges had required months to construct. The cave systems and bunkers on Iwo Jima represented a similar investment, and Okinawa, as the gateway to the Japanese home islands, received the most extensive defensive preparation of all. More than 60,000 Japanese troops protected by thousands of fortified positions covering every approach. Tadashi Koga had arrived on Okinawa in February of 1945 as part of the 62nd Division's reinforcement. He was 22 years old, from a farming family in Hokkaido. He had been conscripted in 1943 and sent first to Manchuria for basic training, then to Kyushu for additional preparation, and finally to Okinawa, as the Japanese High Command concentrated forces for what everyone understood would be a critical battle. His training had emphasized the defensive doctrine: build strong, hold firm, make the Americans bleed. His officers told him that American industrial might produce vast quantities of weapons, but that Japanese spirit and defensive skill could offset material disadvantage. Good fortifications, they said, were the equalizer. A man in a properly constructed bunker was worth 10 men in the open. The Americans invaded Okinawa on April 1st, 1945. The initial landings met little resistance. The Japanese defensive plan deliberately yielded the beaches to avoid being destroyed by naval bombardment. Instead, Japanese forces waited in prepared positions in Okinawa's rugged interior, where the terrain channeled American advances into killing zones dominated by fortified positions. The plan was working, initially. American forces advancing north from the landing beaches met increasingly fierce resistance as they approached the first main defensive line across the island's southern waist. The Kakazu Ridge, where Koga's bunker was positioned, was a key terrain feature in this defensive line. A coral limestone ridge honeycombed with bunkers and firing positions, overlooking open ground that American troops would have to cross. What Koga and his fellow soldiers didn't know was that the American forces advancing toward them carried a revolutionary technology that had been among the most closely guarded secrets of the war. A secret so sensitive that its use had been restricted for more than 2 years to prevent the enemy from capturing an intact example and understanding how it worked. The technology was called the VT Fuse, variable time fuse, though the VT designation was deliberately misleading cover nomenclature. The real name was proximity fuse, and it represented a breakthrough that fundamentally changed the physics of artillery warfare. Traditional artillery shells used one of two fusing methods: impact fuses that detonated on contact, or time fuses that detonated after a preset delay calculated to make the shell explode at a desired point in its trajectory. Both methods had severe limitations. Impact fuses only detonated shells when they hit something solid, meaning their effectiveness was limited against troops in trenches or behind cover. Time fuses required precise calculation of shell velocity, air density, and trajectory. Calculations that were often wrong due to variations in barrel wear, propellant temperature, or atmospheric conditions. An artillery piece might fire 50 shells with time fuses aimed to burst above enemy positions, and perhaps 15 would actually airburst at the correct height. The rest would burst too high to be effective, or too low, or fail to detonate entirely. The VT proximity fuse solved this problem through a mechanism that seemed almost magical. Each fuse contained a miniature radio transmitter and receiver, powered by a generator spun up by the shell's acceleration during firing. As the shell flew toward its target, the fuse transmitted radio waves. When the shell approached the ground or any solid object, the radio waves reflected back. When the reflected signal reached sufficient strength, indicating the shell was at the optimal height for maximum blast effect, the fuse triggered detonation. The entire system had to be miniaturized enough to fit inside an artillery shell, rugged enough to survive the shock of being fired from a cannon at accelerations exceeding 20,000 times gravity, and reliable enough to work every single time. American engineers at Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory and the National Bureau of Standards had begun working on proximity fuse technology in 1940 and had produced operational fuses by 1943. The technology was so revolutionary and so potentially war-winning that its use was initially restricted to anti-aircraft artillery fired over water. If a shell failed to detonate and fell into the ocean, the enemy couldn't recover it to study. The first combat use came in January of 1943 when the American cruiser Helena used VT Fuzed 5-inch shells to shoot down Japanese aircraft attacking Guadalcanal. The results were dramatic. VT Fuses increased the probability of shooting down an attacking aircraft by a factor of 3 compared to conventional time fuses. But the real potential of VT Fuzes technology wasn't in air defense. It was in field artillery against ground targets. An artillery shell fused to detonate at optimal height above ground, typically 20 to 30 feet, created a blast pattern that was devastating against exposed or lightly protected infantry. The explosion above ground meant the blast wave and shrapnel radiated downward and outward in a lethal cone. Troops in foxholes or trenches, who would be protected from shells exploding at ground level, were fully exposed to airburst. And critically, the shrapnel and blast wave could reach into defensive positions through firing ports, ventilation shafts, and other openings that were necessary for fortifications to function. The Americans had tested VT Fuses extensively in ground bombardment roles, but had restricted their use because of security concerns. Every shell fired on land created a risk that an intact fuse might be recovered by the enemy. Japanese or German engineers examining a captured VT fuse would immediately understand its significance and would begin developing countermeasures or copying the technology. The decision to begin using VT fuses for ground bombardment required weighing the immediate military advantage against the long-term risk of technology compromise. By April of 1945, that calculation had changed. American forces were advancing toward the Japanese home islands, and the defensive fortifications on Okinawa represented the kind of challenge where VT fuses could make a critical difference. The security risk of technology compromise seemed acceptable, given that Germany was on the verge of defeat. and Japan's industrial capacity to copy complex electronics was limited, even if they captured intact fuses. On April 6, 1945, American artillery batteries on Okinawa received authorization to begin using VT Fuses against ground targets. 5 days later, Private First Class Tadashi Koga experienced the result. The bombardment that hit Kakazu Ridge on April 11th was unlike anything the Japanese defenders had experienced before. American artillery pieces, primarily 105mm and 155mm howitzers, fired a mixture of conventional impact-fused shells and the new VT-fuzed shells. The conventional shells hit the ground and exploded as expected. The VT-fuzed shells exploded in the air above the defensive positions. From the Japanese perspective inside their bunkers, the difference was immediately and horrifyingly apparent. Conventional artillery bombardment created a recognizable pattern. You heard the incoming shells. You took cover in your fortification. The shells impacted with a sequence of ground-level explosions. Shrapnel and blast effects were absorbed by the fortification's walls and overhead cover. When the bombardment lifted, you emerged, shaken but largely unharmed, ready to engage attacking infantry. This was the contract that made defensive warfare viable. Fortifications protected you from artillery, buying time for infantry combat where Japanese troops' fighting spirit and defensive positions gave them advantage, despite American material superiority. VT Fuse bombardment broke this contract. The shells still announced themselves with incoming whistles, but they didn't impact the ground. They exploded overhead, and the blast wave punched down into positions from above and swept through openings from the side. Firing ports that provided fields of fire became channels for overpressure and shrapnel. Ventilation shafts designed to prevent suffocation became conduits for blast effects. Trenches that were protected from ground-level explosions became killing zones when shells burst directly above them. And the psychological effect of this was immediate and profound. The protection that soldiers had counted on, that they'd labored for weeks to construct, had suddenly become ineffective, or worse, had become a trap that concentrated blast effects in confined spaces. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Koga's survival of that first VT bombardment left him with injuries that would normally have earned evacuation to a field hospital. Burst eardrums, probable concussion, cracked ribs from the blast concussion. But there was no evacuation possible. The American advance had isolated his unit's section of the defensive line. Medical supplies were limited, and most critically, every able-bodied man was needed because the Americans were attacking, and the VT bombardment had been preparation for an infantry assault. What happened over the next 72 hours represented a microcosm of how VT Fuse technology transformed the tactical dynamics of the Okinawa campaign. American infantry advancing toward the Kakazu Ridge positions had been briefed that their artillery was using new ammunition that would be more effective against fortifications. They didn't understand the technical details. Most frontline troops didn't know what a proximity fuse was, but they could see the results. Defensive positions that should have been able to pour devastating fire onto American approaches were silent or firing sporadically. Bunkers that should have required direct assault by engineers with demolition charges had already been suppressed by artillery. Japanese soldiers who emerged from fortifications to engage American infantry were visibly disoriented, bleeding from ears and noses, moving with the uncoordinated actions of men suffering from severe concussion. The Americans took the first line of bunkers on Kakazu Ridge on April 12th. Koga's position was in the second line, 50 yards behind the crest. He watched through his bunker's firing port as American infantry worked their way forward using standard combined arms tactics, tanks providing direct fire support, infantry moving in small groups using terrain for cover, engineers preparing to assault bunkers that continued to resist. But the resistance was fragmentary, disorganized. The VT bombardment had done more than cause casualties. It had disrupted command and control, destroyed communications wire, and created a pervasive sense among Japanese defenders that their primary defense, their fortifications, had become their greatest vulnerability. On the morning of April 13th, American artillery began another bombardment of Koga's position. This time he knew what was coming. The sound of the first shell's arrival sent a spike of pure panic through him. He pushed himself into the farthest corner of the bunker, away from the firing port, trying to make himself as small as possible. The other survivors in the bunker did the same. The VT shells began detonating overhead with that characteristic crack boom that was distinct from ground-level impacts. A sharper report followed by the bass rumble of the main explosion, and then the ringing, rattling sensation of shrapnel striking the bunker's exterior and the awful pressure wave that seemed to squeeze the air itself. The bombardment lasted 20 minutes. When it ended, 3 of the 7 men in Koga's bunker were dead or dying. One man had been struck by shrapnel that came through the firing port, a fragment no larger than a fingernail that had penetrated his neck and severed his carotid artery. Another had been killed by overpressure alone. He had no visible wounds, but blood ran from his ears, nose, and mouth, and he had stopped breathing. The third was wounded in the abdomen and would die over the next 6 hours because there was no way to evacuate him and no medical supplies beyond basic bandages. Koga himself was now deaf in his right ear and had sustained additional concussion injuries that left him with double vision and difficulty maintaining balance. But he was still considered combat effective by the standards of a defensive force that was being systematically destroyed. His sergeant, one of the few remaining NCOs in the company, told him that their orders were to hold position until death. There would be no withdrawal. The defensive line had to hold because fallback positions farther south were not yet fully prepared. Every day they delayed the American advance was a day gained for preparation of the final defensive positions protecting the southern portion of Okinawa. What Koga couldn't know was that his experience was being replicated across the entire front. American artillery batteries had received large stocks of VT Fuzed ammunition, and fire direction officers were rapidly learning how to employ this new capability most effectively. The optimal technique emerged through trial and error, mixed fire missions using approximately 30% VT fused shells and 70% conventional high explosive shells. The conventional shells created the ground-level impacts and cratering that disrupted terrain and cut communications wire. The VT shells created the airbursts that neutralized personnel in fortifications and open positions. Together, the combination was far more effective than either type alone. American after-action reports from the Kakazu Ridge fighting documented the effectiveness. One artillery battery commander noted that bunker positions that had previously required multiple direct hits to neutralize could now be suppressed with area fire at significantly reduced ammunition expenditure. An infantry company commander reported that Japanese defensive fire from fortified positions had decreased by an estimated 60 to 70% after VT bombardment compared to conventional artillery preparation. Most tellingly, American casualties during the Yatsi assault phase dropped noticeably. Fewer defending troops were capable of delivering effective fire, and those who did emerge from fortifications were often disoriented and unable to aim accurately. The technical specifications of the VT Fuzes themselves represented an extraordinary engineering achievement that Japanese forces had no capability to match. Each fuse contained a vacuum tube radio transceiver. In 1945, vacuum tubes were still the standard for all electronics, and they were notoriously fragile. miniaturizing a vacuum tube radio small enough to fit in an artillery shell, making it rugged enough to survive the launch shock, and ensuring it would function reliably, required breakthroughs in multiple fields. The fuse's generator was spun up to operating speed by a tiny propeller on the fuse's nose that was driven by air resistance as the shell flew through the air. A beautifully simple solution to the problem of powering the electronics. The entire fuse weighed less than 2 pounds and contained components that would not have seemed out of place in a tabletop radio, yet it functioned flawlessly after being subjected to forces that would destroy any commercial electronics. The Americans had produced these fuses by the millions. By the time of the Okinawa campaign, monthly production exceeded 1 million fuses. This wasn't experimental technology being used sparingly. This was mass-produced, issued as standard ammunition, and employed whenever tactical conditions warranted. The industrial capacity required to achieve this level of production. Factories producing precision vacuum tubes by the millions. Assembly lines producing complete fuses at scale. Quality control systems ensuring near-perfect reliability. Represented exactly the kind of material advantage that Japanese defensive doctrine had been designed to offset through fighting spirit and tactical skill. But VT fuses weren't something that could be countered through superior morale or better defensive positions. They rendered traditional defensive fortifications significantly less effective through a fundamental change in how artillery worked. Japanese military intelligence did eventually capture intact VT fuses and began analyzing them. Technical intelligence reports from April of 1945 show that Japanese engineers quickly understood what they were dealing with. One report, translated after the war, noted, "The enemy has developed an artillery fuse employing radio principles to achieve detonation at optimal height above ground. This represents a technological achievement of the highest order. Our fortification doctrine must be revised immediately to account for this capability." But understanding the problem and being able to respond to it were very different things. Revising fortification doctrine required time to design new defensive positions, labor to construct them, and materials that were increasingly scarce. And critically, it required communicating the new doctrine to units in the field and giving them time to implement it. None of these things were available in April of 1945 on Okinawa. For Tadashi Koga, the tactical implications were more immediate and personal. On April 14th, American forces assaulted his section of the defensive line with tanks and infantry supported by another VT bombardment. Koga's bunker took a direct hit from a tank's 75-millimeter gun that penetrated the firing port and exploded inside the confined space. Koga survived, barely, because he had been in the bunker's small side chamber when the shell hit. The blast killed everyone in the main chamber instantly. The explosion also collapsed part of the bunker's roof, trapping Koga in the side chamber with limited air, no water, no food, and injuries that included severe burns on his left arm and shoulder from the tank shell's explosion. He remained trapped for 38 hours. During that time, he could hear fighting continuing outside, the crump of artillery, the rattle of machine gun fire, the occasional rumble of tank engines. Twice he heard American voices directly outside the bunker shouting to each other in English. He waited for them to investigate the bunker to discover him, to either kill him or take him prisoner. They didn't. The bunker's collapsed state apparently convinced them it was fully destroyed and not worth the risk of entry. On the evening of April 15th, Koga managed to shift enough rubble to create an opening large enough to crawl through. He emerged after dark into a landscape that had been transformed. The defensive line was gone. American troops controlled the ridge. Japanese bodies lay scattered among destroyed fortifications. The sound of fighting had moved south. The front line had shifted during his entrapment. He was now alone, behind American lines, badly wounded, with no clear path back to Japanese positions. He moved south, staying off roads, hiding during daylight in whatever cover he could find. His burns were becoming infected. He had no food and had been surviving on water collected from puddles and streams. On April 18th, 3 days after escaping his bunker, he was discovered by an American patrol while hiding in a cave. He was too weak to resist or flee. The Americans took him prisoner. What happened next violated every expectation Koga had been conditioned to hold about American treatment of prisoners. Japanese military indoctrination had emphasized that Americans would torture and kill prisoners, that surrender meant certain death preceded by humiliation and suffering. Koga expected to be shot. Instead, American medics treated his wounds. They cleaned and dressed his burns, administered sulfa drugs to fight infection, gave him water and food, actual field rations, the same food American troops ate. A Japanese-American interpreter speaking Tokyo-accented Japanese explained that he was now a prisoner of war, that he would be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention, that his wounds would receive medical attention. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Koga's entire understanding of the war had been built on certain assumptions. Japanese forces were spiritually superior. American forces were materially strong but morally weak. Surrender meant torture and death, and fortifications provided protection that could offset material disadvantage. Every one of these assumptions had been proven wrong. The VT bombardment had demonstrated a level of technological sophistication that made Japanese defensive fortifications ineffective. American industrial capacity had produced this sophisticated technology in sufficient quantities to issue it as standard ammunition. And now American treatment of prisoners demonstrated a level of organizational discipline and adherence to international law that contradicted everything Japanese propaganda had claimed. Koga was evacuated through the American medical system, first to a battalion aid station, then to a field hospital, and eventually to a POW camp on Okinawa itself. The camp was orderly, clean, and run according to strict protocols that protected prisoner welfare. The food was adequate, not abundant, but sufficient and regular. Medical care was provided by American doctors and medics who treated prisoners with the same attention given to American wounded. The psychological impact of this treatment was profound. Koga and other prisoners found themselves forced to reconcile their direct experience of American behavior with years of indoctrination claiming Americans were barbaric, cruel, and racially inferior. But the deeper psychological wound came from understanding what the VT Fuse represented. In the POW camp, prisoners who had served in different units shared their experiences. The pattern was consistent. Traditional defensive positions had been devastated by American artillery using airburst fuses. Casualties in fortifications had been catastrophic. The defensive doctrine that Japanese forces had relied on, dig deep, build strong, hold firm, had been rendered obsolete by a technological innovation that allowed artillery shells to detonate precisely at the height that maximized their effectiveness against entrenched defenders. Japanese military engineers among the prisoners attempted to reconstruct how the VT Fuse worked based on their observations. They understood it was some kind of proximity sensor, but the mechanism remained mysterious. The Americans weren't discussing technical details with prisoners, but the capability itself was undeniable. One Japanese artillery officer in the camp estimated, based on his observation of American bombardments before his capture, that perhaps 70 to 80% of VT-fused shells detonated at optimal height, compared to perhaps 15 to 20% for traditional time-fused shells attempting the same result. That fourfold increase in effectiveness represented the difference between survivable bombardment and catastrophic destruction of defensive positions. The statistics bore this out. Japanese casualties on Okinawa were appalling, even by the standards of Pacific War fighting. Of the approximately 100,000 Japanese military personnel defending Okinawa, more than 90,000 were killed. American casualties were also severe. More than 12,000 American servicemen killed and 38,000 wounded. But the casualty ratio was far more favorable to American forces than it had been in earlier island campaigns, despite the fact that Japanese forces on Okinawa had been fighting from extensively prepared defensive positions in favorable terrain. Multiple factors contributed to this, but post-war analysis consistently identified VT Fuzed artillery as a major contributor to American tactical effectiveness. The broader implications extended beyond Okinawa. American planners preparing for the anticipated invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, scheduled for November of 1945, incorporated VT Fuzed artillery as a standard element of fire support planning. The assumption was that Japanese defensive fortifications on Kyushu and Honshu would be even more extensive and sophisticated than on Okinawa. VT Fuzes would be critical to neutralizing these defenses without requiring prohibitive casualties among attacking American forces. Production of VT Fuzes was ramped up dramatically in preparation for these operations. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945 and Japan's subsequent surrender meant that Operation Downfall never occurred, and the full-scale employment of VT Fuzes against home island defenses never happened. But the technology's impact on the Okinawa campaign had already demonstrated its war-winning potential. For Tadashi Koga, the end of the war in August brought a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that the fighting had ended, grief for lost comrades and for the wider suffering the war had caused, and a deep, unsettling understanding that everything he had been taught about the war, about Japanese superiority, about the effectiveness of fighting spirit against material power, about the reliability of defensive doctrine, had been fundamentally wrong. The VT Fuse was emblematic of this wider failure. Japanese forces had fought with extraordinary courage and endurance, had built defensive positions with great skill and effort, and had employed tactics that should have made American advances prohibitively costly. But American technological and industrial superiority had rendered these advantages insufficient. Koga remained in the POW camp until early 1946, when he was repatriated to Japan. He returned to Hokkaido, to his family's farm, and tried to resume civilian life. His hearing never fully recovered. His right ear remained completely deaf, and he suffered tinnitus for the rest of his life. The psychological scars were less visible but equally permanent. In interviews conducted decades later as part of oral history projects documenting Japanese veterans' experiences, Koga spoke about April 11, 1945, the day he first experienced VT bombardment, as the moment when he understood that Japan could not win the war. Not because of any lack of courage or skill among Japanese forces, but because the material and technological gap was simply too vast to bridge through fighting spirit alone. The VT proximity fuse itself remained classified as a military secret for several years after the war, though details gradually became public through technical publications and historical accounts. The fuse represented one of the major Allied technological achievements of World War II, alongside radar, the atomic bomb, and advanced cryptography. Unlike the atomic bomb, which was a single-use strategic weapon, the VT Fuse was a tactical technology that could be mass-produced and employed in conventional combat operations. Its development required breakthroughs in miniaturization, ruggedness, and reliability that would influence post-war electronics development. The techniques developed for making vacuum tubes survive artillery launch forces, for example, contributed to broader improvements in ruggedized electronics for military applications. Post-war analysis of artillery effectiveness consistently ranked VT Fuses among the most significant advances in field artillery since the development of indirect fire techniques in the early 20th century. The U.S. Army's historical analysis of World War II concluded that VT Fuses had increased the effectiveness of field artillery by a factor of approximately 3 to 4 against personnel targets. Put another way, an artillery battery could achieve the same suppressive effect with 1/3 to 1/4 of the ammunition expenditure when using VT fuses compared to conventional fuses. In logistical terms, this meant American forces could deliver more effective fires while requiring less ammunition resupply, a significant advantage in the island-hopping campaigns of the Pacific, where logistics were always a constraint. The Japanese experience with VT fuses became a case study in the challenges of defending against rapid technological innovation during warfare. Japanese defensive doctrine had been sound, given the state of artillery technology in the early 1940s. Fortifications that provided overhead protection, interlocking fields of fire, and defense in depth made perfect sense when artillery shells had to hit fortifications directly or use unreliable time fuses to achieve airbursts. But VT fuses changed the fundamental equation. Suddenly, overhead protection was less valuable because shells could reliably detonate just above ground level. Firing ports necessary for defending positions became vulnerabilities through which blast effects could enter. The very concept of fortifications as reliable protection against artillery had to be rethought. Japanese military engineers did develop countermeasures, at least in theory. Post-war documents show proposals for deeper underground positions with multiple layers of overhead protection, for fortifications with sophisticated ventilation systems that could be sealed shut during bombardment, for distributed defensive positions that minimized the effectiveness of area bombardment. But these remained largely theoretical. Implementing them would have required time, materials, and engineering capabilities that Japan simply didn't possess by 1945. And fundamentally, they would have been responding to one American technological advantage while American forces were continuing to develop other advantages: improved tanks, better close air support coordination, more effective amphibious assault techniques. This asymmetry, American ability to innovate faster than Japan could respond, was itself a product of the industrial and scientific base disparity that Japanese strategic planners had underestimated when choosing to go to war in 1941. The VT fuse required not just individual genius or a single breakthrough, but an entire industrial and scientific ecosystem capable of taking a laboratory concept and scaling it to mass production in under 3 years. It required factories that could produce precision vacuum tubes by the millions, quality control systems that could ensure near-perfect reliability, logistics systems that could deliver fuses to artillery batteries across the Pacific, training programs that could teach fire direction officers how to employ the new technology effectively, and underlying all of this, an economy large enough to produce all of this while simultaneously building ships, aircraft, tanks, and everything else required for a global war. For the individual soldiers like Tadashi Koga, who experienced VT bombardment directly, these macro-level factors were less important than the immediate visceral understanding that the protection they had counted on had evaporated. The 8 seconds between hearing an incoming shell and its airburst detonation overhead, the time Koga had counted during that first bombardment, was insufficient to take meaningful protective action. Traditional doctrine taught soldiers to take cover and wait for ground-level impacts. But with VT fuses, taking cover in a fortification could make you more vulnerable, not less. The blast wave and shrapnel that swept through firing ports and other openings was amplified by the confined space of a bunker. Men in open foxholes were devastated by the downward-directed blast pattern of airbursts. The tactical adaptations that Japanese forces attempted in response to VT bombardment showed both creativity and the fundamental difficulty of countering a technological advantage through tactical means alone. Some units tried sealing firing ports during bombardment and only opening them when infantry attacks began. But this meant they couldn't observe approaching attackers or deliver defensive fires during the critical preparation phase. Some units tried dispersing defenders into smaller, more numerous positions to minimize casualties from any single airburst. But this fragmented defensive coordination and made positions easier to overwhelm in detail. Some units tried constructing deeper underground positions with serpentine entry tunnels that would dissipate blast effects, but this required time and materials that weren't available, and created positions that could be sealed shut by enemy engineers, trapping defenders inside. None of these adaptations addressed the fundamental problem. American artillery using VT Fuses could deliver suppressive fires against Japanese defensive positions with unprecedented effectiveness, and Japanese forces had no equivalent capability to respond. Japanese artillery on Okinawa was limited in quantity. American preliminary bombardment and air superiority had destroyed many Japanese guns before the ground campaign even began. Those guns that remained were increasingly short of ammunition due to American interdiction of supply lines. And even if Japanese forces had possessed adequate artillery, they lacked VT Fuse or equivalent technology. Japanese time-fused artillery shells achieved airbursts perhaps 15 to 20% of the time when that was the intended effect. American VT-fused shells achieved airbursts 70 to 80% of the time. That fourfold difference in reliability meant that in any artillery duel, American forces had an overwhelming advantage. The question of what would have happened if Japan had developed equivalent technology earlier in the war is counterfactual speculation, but it's worth considering briefly because it highlights the scope of the achievement. Developing VT fuses required not just the initial invention, but also solutions to multiple cascading problems. The fuse needed to be manufacturable at scale. Every component had to be designed for mass production, not just laboratory demonstration. It needed to be reliable despite being subjected to forces that exceeded 20,000 times gravity during artillery launch. It needed to function across temperature extremes from Arctic cold to tropical heat. It needed to have a safety mechanism that prevented premature detonation while still ensuring reliable arming. It needed to be cost-effective enough to be produced by the millions. Each of these requirements was a separate engineering challenge, and solving them all simultaneously required resources and capabilities that Japan simply didn't possess. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.